Okay, this is an addendum to um, the generalization uh, rant that I gave. So let me just get into it because there's certainly a lot to cover. A lot of this is going to be a response to Slavoj Zizek, but then also just a kind of psychological overview of some of the mechanics that I'm talking about. Um, uh, where should I start? Um, so the kind of the riot happening in America, which has created this moment of essentially opportunism all over the world for race baiters, for South African political race baiting, to feed into this uh, hysterical moment, which is essentially a creation of a media operation that has been in effect for a long time in American society. Um, and there's a whole secondary industry of race baiting of this kind. I mean, you just look at some of the hysterical claims being made that like stop the genocide. I mean, it's completely devoid of any kind of uh, seriousness. It's pure base sentimentality. It's pure base raw emotion that has nothing to do with reality. Um, there is no political demand on the table. It's this vacuous and vague complaint about systemic racism, which is so when you make such a nebulous claim, it's easy for essentially to see the underlying psychological mechanics that is really driving this whole thing, which is basically vulnerable narcissism, and then we understand we can also we can understand the hypocrisy in this kind of disgusting politics. In some sense, the complaint against systemic racism is the complaint against the leveraging of stereotypes against people, the leveraging of generalizations against people, as they themselves generalize the society into a racist stereotype. Quite frankly, the level of hypocrisy that's implicit in this very kind of disgusting form of fascistic style politics. A kind of it's a very thinly veiled form of naked tribalism, um, and it also gives a bit of a window into understanding why sexism existed in traditional society. In a lot of ways, sexist stereotypes and how culture was structured around sexism was in a sense to create a stereotype that could contain vulnerable narcissism, because essentially borderline um, tactics and borderline characteristics and presentation generally within the population, it's true, it falls more so in the female camp than it does in the male camp, although obviously there are male borderlines, but um, female borderlines have even been able to, throughout cultural history, been able to carve out. I do think a lot of our gender relations and our gender politics already still bears the mark. Our culture has still not been able to come to grips with actually, looking at women fairly, and contrasting it against the it's not just that women were treated as second-class citizens; they also had special privileges, which culturally we still haven't been able to pick that apart. And in fact, as we were making progress and starting to pick that apart in the 90s, then we had this disgusting kind of identitarian feminism that has exploded vulnerable narcissism everywhere. But in some sense, this was the function of sexism, was to contain the spread of vulnerable narcissism to everything. So at least if we had to make allowances for it, we made allowances for it within a stereotype, and it was contained within that stereotype. And this is one of the extreme functions of stereotypes. And ironically, the riots around this very hyped up, hyper-realistic, incident in some sense. I mean, how can a whole society be judged as racist because of one bad incident? It's not feasible. It's unconscionable to think that you can so quickly excuse your bigotry and your prejudice and your generalization of an entire society because you've got one cherry-picked incident, essentially. And, if you want to say, oh, well, this is more than one, look at the statistics, go through the cases. It's disgusting how insignificant this sort of thing is. The only thing that you can get away with is saying that it's emblematic of this greater scourge of racism or something like that. And as soon as you make that kind of vague claim, then you get so far away from reality and just so far into the hyper-realism that has been constructed fraudulently from the secondary economy of vulnerable narcissism. Now, this is, so when you get a toxic subculture or a toxic, and this, sadly, I think is one of actually the cultural causes of what keeps African Americans in America within their mediocre culture, as it were, their culture of manufacturing mediocrity to self agonize and to prove the self-fulfilling prophecy, and therefore to keep the accusation against the system. It's I believe that's where the cycle actually starts. It doesn't start from, oh, the repression is what causes the disparity in crime statistics. And if we even just look at things as they stand in terms of what the crime statistics actually are, you would expect there to be more mistakes made by police. You would expect there to be more cases of egregious issues. I mean, in general, in terms of, no human institution is ever going to be perfect. But I mean, if in the face of, if you actually look at how the crime statistics and, there's a failure rate of police, there's misconduct by police at a certain rate, and the extent to which it is not expressed against blacks in America is actually, quite frankly, astounding. If anything, the failure rate of police overexpresses itself with, if you break it down by racial, on racial lines. So the idea that police are targeting, I mean, also if you look at the Aubrey case, with any kind of due diligence of actually thinking through what actually happened and all the components of what happened there, and how it's been, frankly, disgustingly interpreted. I went into that in the last recording, so I'm not going to repeat that. But, the facts of that set of events, there's nothing improper that occurred there. Absolutely nothing. The extent to which you can say that the citizen's arrest was actually taking place was after suspicion had already effectively been escalated by the person running from the scene. And, I'll just say as well, as just a general sort of thing. I mean, you see these sort of emotive sort of things. I mean, I know because I've spoken to people on this matter, and I've seen the debates. I mean, this is going to sound almost like a banal sort of thing, but I mean, the reason why, if mistakes, why mistakes happen more often than not, is because people dress in essentially in a very sort of vague and nebulous kind of way. Oh, okay, I'm not butchering this, let me just say it outright and then give the reasoning post hoc, is that when people are walking around in hoodies, you can be carrying anything in a hoodie. You could be carrying like any kind of weapon or a gun. It's not a police friendly piece of attire. And when police have to, I mean, and why do these people wear hoodies like they do? it's because it implies a potential threat. And I mean, you can say that, well, that might be because they live in a dangerous culture, they live in a dangerous surroundings, and they need to look like that they are potentially carrying something. They need to look like that they might, you know, but you know, these things start to make sense of the world, and then you can break down this hyper-realism that is constructed by the media, because you don't see the full array of statistical outcomes. They don't report every time a policeman has been killed on the job. You don't get that back and forth. You don't get a sense of what's actually going on. You just get this very particularized thread of the narrative, which then is woven into the sentimentality. And then you're fighting systemic oppression, which, I mean, is it even real, or is it more of a, I mean, and I already explored the very small section in which systemic oppression exists, which is like, it's almost not even worth talking about. It's so negligible. And this idea that essentially the shape of everything is what is systemically oppressive, you know, that everything aggregates to that, and at which point you've completely thrown out any kind of accountability, any kind of responsibility. You've just sort of thrown that into, well, no, it's everyone's collective sort of issue. And that's what I wanted to get into in touching on Slavoj Zizek talking. He gave a quote from some Black Panther in some dialogue, and you know, it's exactly the kind of disgusting, self-sympathizing, fascistic worldview, which essentially it's got its sort of intellectually dishonest tentacles on everything, to the extent to which it can't be refuted. It's just it's like a tautological table thumping, you know, echo chamber. It's not capable of even you know. And the level to which, you know, anyone talking on this issue has already sort of to concede the real, the objective reality behind it, or at least just the common sense reality below these things is frankly, you know, it's delusional, and it just shows the kind of the level of toxicity and the level of vulnerable narcissism, and how much cultural currency it holds. But anyway, in me talking about sexism, I just wanted to at least use that as a way to sort of illustrate that, well, I mean, in some sense, we can understand traditional sexism in that wise, therefore, and forgive it to some extent. I mean, I'm not saying that it was the best solution, but it was a solution. It was a form of triage. Because you can't just have vulnerable narcissism infecting everything, because the only way to stabilize a culture like that is basically a kind of ethno-nationalism of the kind that Hitler envisaged. And, you know, that is really the de facto politics underlying the Black Panthers, underlying Black Lives Matter, underlying any complaint of systemic oppression, is essentially it's nationalism for the identity in a kind of transnational sort of outlook. And, oh, okay, I'm going to put a link to Slavoj Zizek's thing, so it'll have the quote there, but he, okay, I should have finished one of these things before moving on, but anyway, my point about the juxtaposition with traditional sexism is that, in some sense, if a group of people are so toxically addicted to leveraging stereotypes, and then essentially you use a stereotype to sort of contain it, so that you don't have it spread to everything, so that you can sort of cordon it off, even though you've sort of surrendered that whole subset, in some sense, then gets sort of thrown away as the baby with the bathwater. Now, the antidote to all of this is non-racialism or non-sexism, but that has essentially been abandoned by this collective guilt ideology, by this systemic oppression kind of conceptualization of things. Because as soon as you've got that, I wanted to illustrate this with the Slavoj Zizek quote. So the Slavoj Zizek quote of this, it's not a quote of Slavoj Zizek, it's Slavoj Zizek quoting this Black Panthers guy. Sort of, it's so disgusting, even this quote. So it was sometime in the 70s, and he was talking to some Freudian, and he was basically saying, oh no, this is a real empire, and it's an empire that's worse than the Roman Empire because it really covers everything, and essentially it was all to do with capitalism, and it's almost like a kind of implicit criticism of capitalism or something like that. And it says that, there's no even point about talking about decolonization because it's not possible, because you cannot break away from this empire, because now that's not even true. You could break away from global capitalism. There's nothing stopping you. The fact that people don't is... Am I still recording? Okay, I'm not sure if that was interrupted by a phone call. The fact that people don't... break away from the capitalism chain. In some sense, is emblematic that they don't want to live without it, in some sense. So in some sense, oh, well, America is this horrible empire because people feel insecure not using capitalism because capitalism is better, or something like that. I mean, it's disgusting, essentially, to make systems that are effective and that are superior and are elected to be deployed and employed by people who have essentially political economies that have a choice, and then they choose and they elect essentially to use what becomes an integrated system of commerce, rather than choosing autarky and insulation and essentially ethnofascism, the politics of ethnofascism. Well, because they don't choose insularity, because they don't choose a kind of cultural ethnic relativism and ethnic pride, because they instead choose to sort of be liberal and open and integrated, then somehow automatically that means that the integrated system is itself an oppressive system. I mean, you're just going to interpret it that way. I mean, how fucking intellectually dishonest can you be? I mean, essentially, that a system must be successful and then it must be denigrated because of its success, because essentially its so-called victims can't live without it. I mean, the idea that, oh, it's not possible to decolonize. Why isn't it possible to decolonize? Why isn't it possible to break away from commerce, from international commerce? Because it's not politically feasible? Because it would be to give up too much? Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry that you would actually have to lose something to underwrite your own choices. It's fucking disgusting. The level of tautological, self-referential, the level that essentially vulnerable narcissism always casts this meta-narrative, essentially, that underwrites its own cherry-picked confection of hyper-realism. I mean, as far as I can tell, this quote is proof of what I always generally say when I opine on the Black Panthers, that they were fascists, essentially. They were ethno-nationalists at the core of it. And they used the same worldview that all fascists have, which is you have this collective, systemic, sort of thing, and then you can leverage that collective guilt however you want to, because essentially if you're because essentially then any disruption to the status quo is revolutionary, is virtuous, is morally good. So you can do whatever the bar for progress is essentially anything. that is disruptive or destabilizing. So essentially, then you can take hostages as you so wish. You know, there's no such thing as responsibility for the person who is in the corner, as it were. And so when you paint your ideological distinction as being in the corner because the system itself is so integrated in its oppression, you know, it's I mean, you know, this is intellectual fraud. This is sophistry. Um, this is pseudo intellectualism at its, you know, height, and to sort of and to quote this as being yeah, I mean, in some sense, there's no point of essentially just trying to say, okay, well, the vulnerable narcissism of identity is less absolute and encapsulating of the system, um, I mean, in some sense, it's just a difference of portraying the narrative boogeyman, but the solution is exactly the same. And in fact, this is why Slavoj Zizek tried to use this quote, because essentially he was trying to just say that um, the god of identity is a false god, and there's a greater false god, at least in some sense. That's my interpretation. And um, I mean, in some sense, this could be. I have a soft spot for Marxism, but in some sense, there are formulations of Marxist thought which, to me, are just they might as well be fascistic in their totalitarian um, facilitation of a kind of, you know, it's the kind of Marxism that lenses itself to Leninism, to the kind of Leninist reduction. Um, and a lot of Marx's work is prone to that, is prone to be read in that way. Um, and in some sense, he was, you know, Marxism is an example of a point of view that does sort of slot into this kind of, well, this is a vulnerable narcissism narrative that can be seen as an overarching systemic narrative, you know. I mean, I think it's capable of, people are capable of contemplating a systemic narrative while not emulating it in their mind in some sense, without believing it, as thinking of it as a kind of, as a speculative theoretical possibility, but and that might even give you some sensitivity and some form of insight, but the idea that it should be tackled on the level at which the problem is described, on that level, is just, that will obviously lead to a kind of a fascistic style of authoritarianism, as the Soviet Union essentially just used a class. I mean, what's the difference between class guilt and blood guilt, as it were? You know, something like that. And the kind of the civil war that the fascist state is premised on, in terms of, you know, fighting the Jewish conspiracy, and the civil war that the Soviet Union was engaged in terms of I don't know what they called it, but they probably called it something, you know, bourgeois infiltration or bourgeois ideals or something like that. Uh, as they essentially underwrite a whole system that's based on a nomenclatura that imposes itself um, as a new elite, essentially. So, you know, you always have these very brittle distinctions, which are all important according to the ideological reduction, and then they essentially make way and facilitate a whole uh, uh, secondary economy of even more pernicious deception, dishonesty, and oppressiveness. You know, so essentially, you replace one kind of oligarchy for another, in some sense, and in some sense, the, you know, if capitalism is actually just looked at and managed responsibly without these systemic narratives, you can actually fix problems. You can actually deal with things. You can actually have real politics. Can actually clean itself. But you do need to have certain ideological cornerstones so that politics can actually function. And those cornerstones would be something like non-racialism and non-sexism. It is the only thing that de-escalates the kind of toxicity. And in some sense, if you don't de-escalate the toxicity, if you don't develop the ideological solution that does de-escalate it and that does actually show you the proximate causes and identify or at least allow for the clarity to identify the root causes and the practical challenges that actually maintain the system and in some sense, the ironic thing is that these riots, all this action by Black Lives Matter effectively is a debasement of liberal politics, and in some sense they are quite hypocritically leveraging de facto an argument as to why segregation is preferable, why segregation into a kind of ethno-state or something like that would be preferable because of their hypocritical leveraging of stereotypes against the society. So somehow the society must be colorblind, but they are not allowed to be colorblind, is this kind of inconsistency. And if you say, okay, well, no, the society does actually have a problem, quantify it. Like actually, there has been no serious request as to what should change, except for retarded, insane, nonsensical demands like removing all police, defunding the police, when the police aren't even the problem. If anything, the police are underreacting to statistical realities in some sense. And if you understand that the police itself is a function that doesn't have 100% perfection, that there are malfeasance, there are mistakes as well, and if you look at those and you quantify them, not really significant. In fact, to call that a genocide is, it's beyond hyperbolic. It's if there ever was a time for the understanding of Noam Chomsky's manufacturing consent and manufacturing essentially reality, I mean, to be quite cynical, to me, if I'm looking at this from the outside, it seems that the Democrats knew that they were going to do very, very badly in the next election. And in some sense, this was the gambit. This whole media operation was somehow the kind of the Joe Biden sort of angle. I mean, I know that sounds incredibly cynical, but the level to which there is absolutely nothing underlying the so-called movement, the so-called cause, this cause is it's disgusting, naked race baiting, essentially. And ironically, it undermines its own position in some sense. Ironically, it flaunts its own hypocrisy. It flaunts its own hypocritical use of stereotypes, the kind of double standards, evidentiary double standards that are used, the lack of factual basis, that you can have, and I'm saying conceding that, let's just say that this was, the problem is this idea that you can read someone's mind. I mean, you understand that like this policeman that did this bad thing was surrounded by 3 other policemen who were not white. Okay, so the idea that this happened because of racism rather than because the policeman himself is has some general problem, like somehow no they have already read his mind, that he didn't just recklessly kill someone, he recklessly killed someone because of racism, like that's that's frankly that's too far. And I mean, it's, to project this onto reality, in order to construct such a hyperbolic interpretation, um, of systemic oppression, you know, uh, in essence, the tremendous sense of almost cultural cannibalism to exteriorize blame onto other groups or onto other people, to excuse the mediocrity, to excuse the cultural self sabotage. Like, the I mean, if you just juxtapose this in terms of how many black people kill black people in America each year, and how many cops kill black people, and how many cops kill unarmed black people in America, and if you just put up those numbers, it's disgusting to see how this is being cast. That, oh well, it's because black people are killed by police in such an insignificant proportion to all those other things that I've just mentioned, that it causes the internal violence. Like, I mean, you have to come up with such nonsense theories to sort of try to work out how it's white America's fault. I mean, it's the level of nonsense that, in some sense, the level of the overreaction is somewhat, um, symbolic of the internal, intellectual fraud that the whole thing is based on. That essentially, because the vulnerable narcissism is already wound so tight and already is needed to as a cultural, um, piece of the engine, a cultural, part of this device, and it's already working overtime. That essentially, yeah, I mean, it's begging to be condemned by the system. It's begging to be reacted against, because only if it's reacted against by actual racism, in some sense, the black society in America is calling for real racism to justify its systemic conspiracy theories of systemic oppression. And that's the kind of I mean, this is why I call it borderline culture in essence. And it's been promulgated from academia, from pseudo intellectuals, from because essentially race baiting has become a, uh, uh, in the same way that Aryan studies in Weimar Germany was made a credible study, race and gender studies has become essentially. I mean, it is absolutely no different. The kind of the genetic superiority that the Aryans were arguing in their Aryan studies is no different from the superiority in justice, in social justice, which is, bestowed on people's historical identity and their inheritance of their historical story and narrative, in this system. It's exactly the same function. So, these people are essentially fascists, and because of their fascistic political outlook, they are looking for confirmation of essentially what the Germans, used in their propaganda, to complain about, the Jewish, conspiracy. They need confirmation of their racial conspiracy, and you know so it would be nice essentially if, they complain in such a way so as to court and so as to attract and so as to coerce, a reaction which then they can use to confirm their narrative retroactively. So this is the problem: is that they've had this vulnerable narcissism for so long, and they haven't had enough reason essentially to have it confirmed. Um, and essentially, because the system can't call them out, because academically or intellectually somehow these people have already just they've grabbed the moral currency somehow. They own the moral currency. They are the only ones who are allowed to print it. And um, even so, Slavoj Zizek essentially has to be to make his points about identity being toxic, he first has to essentially concede the factual point that this whole thing is premised on, that he even says, you know, oh, this thing is emblematic. Sadly, I think his view, I mean, I can't exactly speculate to say that it's not genuinely held, but I think he must at least have some doubt that the line that he is taking is what's the word? He's taking it just so that he can at least be heard on some subset of the matter. Because if he took, yeah, okay, I'm basically saying that his point is slightly has been tailored just so that he can get his message out, because he's in the belly of the beast. He still doesn't fully understand that the nature of snakes that he's surrounded by, essentially. And to me, it seems like he's saying he has to make these kinds of concessions that he can, so that he doesn't get swallowed by this larger snake, as it were. But anyway, okay, I think I covered everything that I wanted to cover. But yeah, I mean, and you know that you're in this kind of toxic game, essentially, when there's nothing actually being asked for, when what is being asked for is not tangible, it's some esoteric thing. Oh, we want people to just treat us better. We want everything to be better in some holistic sort of sense. It's like, well, you know, that's not really taking responsibility. That's not really actually saying that this would make a difference, because they don't have any policy demands. They don't have any solid, practical anything, because it's just a feeling, because it's the feeling itself is a cultural fabrication in some sense, or it's a cultural production, and it actually comes from within, essentially, these mediocre subcultures, or these subcultures that produce mediocrity, that depend on it, and then essentially disguise it in the systemic complaints. I haven't gone into all the detail, but I mean, you know, the problems in the black community are obvious in America. You know, they have been talked about ad nauseum for a long time by many people, and I'm not going to trot them out and go over them here. But looking up Thomas Sowell, looking up Larry Elder, looking up, you know, any kind of responsible spokesperson that's realistically actually concerned about fixing these problems. And, you know, a lot of it is based on the psychology aspect. It's not based on, you know, well, it's not just obviously the psychology aspect, but that's a big component of it, essentially, as to how you get into these single mother households at the prolific level that it occurs, and how that essentially shapes people's destinies more than anything else. But the idea that the psychological aspect can just sort of be outsourced and exteriorized as a systemic oppression sort of thing is just you know, that is essentially is the trick of vulnerable narcissism. Is just it never it never affords to itself a choice, only a script within this narrative, which then just gets rational confirmation bias, you know, sort of a kind of as a sort of contagious alignment of interpretation of reality to conform. You know, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. And as soon as you actually look at, well, how does the self-fulfilling prophecy occur at the ground floor? Well, it starts off with this accusation of systemic oppression, and essentially the relegation of non-racialism. If you had non-racialism at any point, you see through all of this very quickly, and you see through like what the actual how this is replicating itself in every generation. Non-racialism is really the biggest sort of fix for this. And in some sense, this has always been what has held back development and progress in America to a large extent, is that non-racialism was adopted by the wider society. I'm not going to say that it was adopted by everyone, but the idea that you have to have 100% adoption of non-racialism by the wider society before essentially before you can switch off the vulnerable narcissism within a subculture is retarded and pathetic. And that means essentially that that's just such a bad faith position. It's also disgusting. It's also essentially saying, well, okay, actually the default position that is the natural position in human history is some kind of ethno-nationalism or some kind of tribalism or something like that. I mean, it's some kind of fascism or something like that is the only other alternative, essentially. But it was adopted by the wider society, and it was adopted by some people within the black community and within the black culture. But essentially, the culture was taken over by vulnerable narcissists. Perhaps because the thought leaders of non-racialism were assassinated. Perhaps that's why. And the only ones that were allowed to continue to be to exist were of the vulnerable narcissistic variety, and so they kind of branded their subculture, and then they always filtered all of reality into that polemic, and the Democrats as well essentially completely entrenched that and sustained that culture. I do think Blexit is essentially the cure, the only sort of fundamental. I do think that I'm sad that it didn't happen sooner. I'm sad that culturally, you would have thought that we wouldn't be this far behind. That something like Blexit, you would have hoped, if it had come in the 90s, if something like Blexit occurred before identity politics, how much of this, but in some sense I guess maybe we needed identity politics to bring this to the fore, to bring up this, essentially it is the ideological reemergence of the old world, of the kind of simplified stereotypical thinking. It is the encapsulation of the racist mentality, of the fascist mentality. And hopefully now it will be defeated for all to see. We will have a cultural recognition of exactly how it's evil, what is wrong with it. Hopefully we will digest and navigate through this and come out immunized from this kind of oversimplified toxic politics that makes, and then perhaps we will have something like the end of history, and we will have achieved it, and it will be woven into our cultural fabric. But I mean, okay, I'm being optimistic from where I am, and there's still a lot of toxicity to sort of process, and even, it's possible for things to swing the other way, essentially. But hopefully people won't do that, because they won't want to agree with these toxic troglodytes, these fascistic, hypocritical, moral parasites and opportunists and elitist oligarchs, which just love disguising their practical corruption, in the virtue signaling rationalism, which is the secondary economy, in some sense. And we can all understand, the level at which this disgusting political game is played. And this discussing political game has existed in other societies for longer. In South Africa, you could say, was in some sense the recent progenitor of it. It's existed in some form in Israel with the Palestinians. The Palestinians have been playing this kind of victimology for some time. Not saying that the Israelis are perfect negotiating partners, but I mean the truth is that Yasser Arafat, if we just want to look at history for a second, Yasser Arafat had no mandate to forge peace because his people do not want peace, because they cannot give land to Jews. It's not possible. And I mean, I'm not saying if that's, I don't know, historic. I mean, to me, the whole, I'm not so happy with the character of the state of Israel. I mean, I don't think I believe in ethno-states, but I mean, the whole thing is a kind of defensive thing. Well, the Holocaust was so terrible. Jews want a homeland because they don't know how geopolitics is going to go. Should they always live in somebody else's country? It's it's certainly a very, very, it's almost on the level of politics, morality. It's sort of it's such a complicated issue. It really is. But I mean, it's very simple that in some sense it's not the victimology and the vulnerable narcissism in the Palestinian sort of case is stuck in a religious polemic and a religious narrative, and that has been an impediment to negotiation that could breach any kind of settlement. That has proven to be a kind of fatalistic impediment that you can't just. It's never possible to make any ground on that ever, in some sense, because there is no way in which there is a where it's justifiable to give up land that is meant to be increased, because essentially, there is a very deep religious conviction that Islam must take over the world, and to lose land to the infidel is just, that basic underlying ideological constraint in some sense means that there's a fundamental stalemate. To the extent to which that stalemate is taken advantage of by the other side, I'm not saying that it's not taken advantage of. I'm not saying that there isn't a subset of real politics, but because essentially there is a vulnerable narcissistic edge to this, that's what makes it insoluble. But if you can get to a kind of proper secular interpretation of things, which on the level of race and sexism would be non-racialism and non-sexism, if you can see politics in those terms, then suddenly everything is soluble, everything functions when you remove the vulnerable narcissism. Then in some sense you could say that the whole instantiation of the Israeli state was a kind of reactive defensive move that's cast in this vulnerable narcissistic narrative, and it does creep into things, and in some sense it only isn't a thing if it's just accorded to the other side at some point, and say, well, actually, we can actually, let's just not even talk about it, let's just take it off the table and let's just continue from there. You actually have at some point, you have, like in the new South Africa, you have a democratic dispensation. You have a constitution that actually enshrines these things as being important, non-racialism and non-sexism. But then it has been betrayed by an investment into vulnerable narcissism, into naked tribalism, into racialist thinking, into racialist morality. And the corruption of the morality and the corruption of the law facilitates a whole slew of oligarchical, kleptocratic government corruption, and what is essentially now a kind of unassailable black elite that can do no wrong because they can always divert the pressure onto white monopoly capital, as the accusation goes. And they are backed up with this race and gender studies. It's the same position as Weimar Germany. Late Weimar Germany is basically where we are. So culturally in the world, I would say, it's very sad. But hopefully, as an opportunity, it will be. This history will hopefully be gold. This history will be the useful development of a cultural constitution, of a cultural consciousness that will be the gold of a form of politics that will not be able to be outsmarted by sort of the same games of this kind of this balkanized escalation of vulnerable narcissism.